are you?
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well, doing well. Thank you so much for joining me.
No problem.
Great. I've recently looked into your work significantly, just in the realms of how kind of basically in the neurotheology side of things in your book. Really enjoyed that. Really enjoy a lot of your lectures as it pertains to meditation and the ensuing effects of mindfulness and meditation on the brain neurologically,
Well,
and
thank you.
find those things very intriguing. And a lot of the research coming out of neurogenesis in the brain that seems to occur sometimes when they do these mindfulness trial studies. And I wanted to discuss some of those kind of things with you.
Okay.
And particularly just wanted to start off asking you kind of what your background is and kind of what brought you to this unique study.
Sure. It's really in many ways been a lifelong pursuit for me. I kind of grew up just always asking a lot of questions, always trying to understand kind of the nature of the universe and reality around us. And part of what I started out with was the idea, well, it has to have something to do with our brain. How does our brain perceive the world? How do we analyze information and think about it and so forth and feel about it?
Uh-huh.
But as I kind of grew up and studied the brain, I realized that there were certain limitations to what science could tell us about that, and started to look into a variety of philosophical and even kind of theological approaches, spiritual approaches, thinking about the nature of consciousness and who we are as human beings. And all of that was kind of swirling around when I got into medical school, and had the very good fortune of having two wonderful mentors. One who taught me everything I know about brain imaging, and we were starting to use it to study all kinds of very traditional stuff like Alzheimer's disease and depression and so forth. And also connected with another mentor who was a psychiatrist and anthropologist by training, who had also been very similarly interested in the study of religion and spirituality and how that relates to the brain. And then finally, as I always like to say, that light bulb went off, and I was like,
Yeah.
gee, if we're doing brain scans of Parkinson's and depression, why can't we do brain scans of religion and spirituality? And that's what that kind of got us started on it. And then we started to look at a whole variety of different spiritual practices from many different traditions. And I think in many ways that's what kind of really expanded the whole ability to think about this whole field of neurotheology, and really looking at the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. And it's been a wonderful journey since, and continues to be. And for me, I mean, it continues to be this pursuit of some fundamental questions about the nature of reality and how we
Yeah.
perceive that reality. So for me, that pursuit is kind of my own kind of combined sense of spiritual as well as scientific endeavors.
Awesome. No, that's great. Those kinds of questions never seem to go away. And
Exactly.
and you mentioned the nature of consciousness in there, and that's something that intrigued me a lot lately. And trying to get to the crux of what it is, how to define it, even is kind of seemingly a difficult task in itself. Uh,
Absolutely.
which, when you start looking into consciousness, you see that the the non-uniformity that exists within the defining of that word leads scientists and philosophers on a lot of different paths, because they're searching ultimately for different things, but maybe not knowing it. Um,
Right. Yeah. In fact, actually, one of my colleagues has been hounding me to write an article with him about that we should get rid of the term consciousness.
yeah, that would be
uh,
good, I think. That would be a worthwhile endeavor, just to clarify the whole study of it, or the philosophy behind mind. And
sure.
speaking of consciousness, that's something that I know it's a hard question, and they call it a hard problem probably for that reason. But when you think of consciousness, how do you see it as being defined, and how do you look at it overall, spiritually and just materially?
Well, no, I mean, obviously, that's a very fundamental question. I'm, picking up on just a couple of things we were just talking about too. I
Yeah.
wrote a book about 10 years ago called Principles of Neurotheology, and the first chapter was really all about definitions. So I completely agree with you that whether it's mind, God, spirituality, or consciousness, we do need to make sure that we understand what we are talking about, so that if I'm having a conversation with you or another colleague, that we understand at least what we're talking about, and
Yeah. Yeah.
and then help to decide whether or not that is the actual thing in and of itself, I guess. But for me, I think, and actually one of the early articles I did with this other mentor was called Consciousness and the Machine, and we talked a lot about kind of the material nature of consciousness, how we talk about the brain and what the brain does, and we can look at the different parts of the brain and how
Yeah.
that can be associated with different thoughts and feelings. But there's this other piece. There's this piece of sort of self recognition, of
Yeah.
self awareness, and so again, not just the proverbial video camera that's looking at the world, recording what happens, but we are aware of the fact that we are looking out at the world, and we are
Yeah.
aware of ourselves doing that.
Yeah.
So that whole self-awareness issue, again, it is quite fascinating. I always kind of put it to my students. I say, look, in the brain you have sodium and potassium ions crossing the neural membranes. You have metabolism and blood flow. You have electrical activity. You have all kinds of neurotransmitters being released. We have
Yeah.
billions of neurons with even billions upon billions of interconnections. And where in all of that is our thoughts, where in all of that is our consciousness.
Yeah.
And can we actually, say that consciousness can be reduced to what's going on in the brain, or is it something that emerges from the properties of the brain, or is it something outside of the brain? And certainly, again, I mean, this is how I got very much into neurotheology and looking at the different traditions, which will say, certainly Buddhist and Hindu type of traditions, which will talk about a universal consciousness
Yeah.
that we connect with in some way. And actually, in our ultimate conclusion in our article, Consciousness and the Machine, was that the material world and the consciousness world may really be just kind of two sides of the same coin. And it maybe we often try to make the argument, much like in quantum mechanics, and not that we're using quantum mechanics to explain consciousness,
Yeah.
although there's some people who also try to do that.
Yeah.
But the quantum mechanics concept of the wave and the particle duality, and it may be that consciousness and the brain, if you look for the thoughts and the feelings, you find the sort of the intangible part of consciousness. But if you do a brain scan, you'll find a tangible part of it. And
That's a good way of putting it. The observer effect, essentially playing into that.
yeah, exactly. And of course, I mean, the biggest problem of all, and this also is why I've gotten into the whole field of neurotheology, from the beginning as a kid, was that we're sort of trapped inside of our own consciousness. And one of the most recent books I wrote with Columbia University Press, called Neurotheology, the first chapter is entitled "The Happy Prison of the Brain," because we're sort of trapped in our brain, looking out at the world, but we're okay with that. And
Yeah.
so we're happy, but there is this interesting problem, and part of that also comes down to the fact that that when you're talking about how in order to know what the reality is of the world, and whether we're accurate in terms of understanding the world,
Yeah.
theoretically you would have to sort of get outside of your brain and kind of look down and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking on the inside, this is what I'm thinking on the outside,
Yeah.
excuse me, this is what I'm thinking on the inside, and this is what actually is happening on the outside, and do they match up? And of course, from a strictly neurological perspective, there's no way to get outside of your brain. But from some of these philosophical and spiritual perspectives, there is, and mystical experiences and spiritual experiences at least purport to be able to do that. Now, again, we could have the argument as to whether they actually do, but the experience is such that a person gets beyond their body, beyond their mind, beyond their brain, and I think that's an important part for us to look at and try to figure out and understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the idea that you mentioned at the beginning of that, centering around the recognition of self, and then attributing memories, thoughts, feelings, patterns of behaviors to the self, kind of establishes this narrative of who you are. And that's kind of an interesting thing that would happen in evolution. When you think about biological evolution, you think about it being oriented towards survival of the fittest, the most suited to their environment. You wouldn't think that it would become evolutionarily pressing to have that emerge in order to improve survival. I mean, at some point we evolved and exposed ourselves on two legs with our vital organs exposed to any projectile danger. We kind of evolved counterintuitively to survival of the fittest at some point, it seems to me. Obviously, there's scientific reasons for that, but it's still kind of interesting. And that's what I was going to ask you, following up on that. There's the thought patterns in Vedic sciences, of course, that claim basically the self is an illusion, and there's this non-dual approach to how we exist within the world. I find that kind of I found it interesting, and I looked into it for a long time, and books like the Bhagavad Gita and things like that, these old spiritual handbooks and manuals. I just didn't seem to mesh too well with the thought of that, this illusory self, because it kind of, to me, seemed nihilistic to a certain extent, because it dissolved the concept of free will out of the equation too, and then meaning kind of goes to the wayside, sort of, as your objective form of being. You want to try to get towards doing better in the world, so you have to have something. The self has to recognize something to orient.
Right.
So speaking on that, I just wanted to ask you how you see that form of consciousness and that form of viewing, this illusory self and things like that. What is your thoughts on the Vedic sciences and how they relate to consciousness?
Well, I understand your thoughts on it. I too have questioned that whole issue, and I guess in a very simplistic way of looking at it, if there is a universal consciousness, then whatever is ourself is just kind of a part of that. And in that regard, I guess, the argument is that it's not really, its own consciousness, but it's just sort of part of the larger whole. And,
Yeah.
I get that. But I also, I also see your point too, and agree with the issue of, it certainly feels like we have our own self-consciousness. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah, yeah.
what do we make of that? And and I think even when I kind of look at these different experiences, uh, I think part of where this discussion ultimately kind of goes, and this is a very central part of what we talk about in neurotheology, is the epistemological piece. What is the nature of reality, and is the self sort of that fundamental realness? What's interesting, of course, is that when you get into these very profound mystical experiences that are talked about in the Vedas and some of the Eastern traditions, that mystical experience, which gets beyond the self, is frequently perceived to be more real than our everyday reality experience, where our sense of self is. And so, there is that interesting dichotomy about that, and that's also part of what contributes to the notion that, well, then this self isn't kind of the real self, and that is a more fundamental experience of reality. Now, I guess in my own mind, I do kind of feel like, well, this self has to have some epistemological,
Significance. Yeah.
significance, even though it may be part of a larger whole, or it may be, connected to a larger consciousness. And but again, it's quite fascinating. I mean, this is to me part of what neurotheology is all about, which is
Yeah.
not just looking at the biology of the brain, but also really asking the questions, and kind of using a, even if you're not using science per se, but you're using a kind of methodological approach by asking the questions. In fact, a lot of what we published recently in the last maybe 5 years was a study of a survey that we had done. It was an online survey where we asked people about their most intense spiritual experiences, and we got about 2,000 respondents from all walks of life, all countries, all traditions, and we got all kinds of data from that, including these narratives. And again, the experiences are perceived to be fundamentally real. In fact, often, as I mentioned, more real than our everyday reality experiences. Many people do talk about ego loss, or losing their sense of self as part of that experience. But then again, the question becomes is, what do we actually make of that, and how do we kind of think about that in terms of what the realness of those experiences actually represents? And one of the things that I, as an example, that I talk to people about a lot, just because I think we all have a reference to it, is the relationship between, for example, dreams and our everyday reality experience. So, when we're sleeping at night and we have a dream, no matter how real it feels, we act in the dream as if that's the real reality. If something's chasing, if a monster's chasing us, we're running in the dream.
Yeah.
We don't stop and say, don't worry about it. It's just a dream. That doesn't happen until we wake up. And then we say, oh, that was an inferior version of reality. And of course,
Yeah.
when people have the mystical experience, they look back on this reality and say, this is, a less real or inferior version. And I worry about hierarchies because I don't know exactly how we define, what is real and what is not, which in and of itself is a fascinating question.
Yes.
But that is part of the whole issue, which is, how do we decide whether the self is real, the experiences of the universe are real, and what experiences we might have. And again, that's part of what led me into all of this, was I thought, well, we're all looking at the same world. I mean, why do we have different religions? Why do we have
Yeah.
Democrats and Republicans? Like we should all be, have the same conclusions, but yet we don't.
Yeah.
and
Yeah. We don't. Yeah.
Well, and I think, studying the brain over the last 30 years, I kind of get it now, which is that, on one hand, we all share certain similarities about things, but on the other hand, every one of our brains is completely unique, and it has to do with our genetics and our upbringing and the people that we've met and the things that we've read and the experiences that we've felt and the emotions that we've had. And when you put all of that together, if there's 7.5 billion people in the world, well, there's 7.5 billion religions and there's 7.5 billion political parties. And, we all
Yeah.
have a slightly different perspective on what the world is. None of us see the world exactly the same way. And it's given me an appreciation for that. And I hope, on a very idealistic level, not to jump to that, but, I hope that may be a way in which we start to resolve some of the larger, more pragmatic differences that we face as human beings in the United States and around the world, to say, maybe we have different perspectives just because we all have a different perspective, and maybe we need to be a little bit more understanding of the fact that somebody came to a conclusion that's different than ours. Doesn't mean they're evil or horrible or anything, but we just came to a different conclusion. So, but
Yeah.
these are also some larger, more practical and sometimes idealistic perspectives on this, because obviously there are some people who come to very negative views about the world and others,
Yeah.
and we need to learn how to work with that as well.
Yes. No, I agree. That's well said. And I I like kind of what you were talking about, that the ego loss or the ego death phenomena that's been kind of termed that to mean, you transcend the sense of self and other to where you are experiencing the oneness, that whereas maybe we're a fractal of a larger object, just like in geometry and just like in the growth of trees, you have fractal patterns emerging out of nature routinely, just like in DNA and things like that. So if we're
Right.
we're a smaller part of a larger whole, those experiences that people have of self-transcendence, it seems to me, or from what I understand, is induced sometimes through meditation, spiritual practices. Psychedelics are something
Right.
been kind of in vogue to speak about in these kind of terms.
Very much so. Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of ask you on ego death, ego loss, self-transcendence, those phenomena, that phenomena that occurs where the barrier between self and other is kind of gone for a moment or for an extended period of time. And then people return from that experience a lot of times feeling as if that experience affects them significantly. A lot
Right.
of people varies, or in some of the studies that I've read, it seems like 80 to 90% psychedelic experiences change somebody's life, or they dramatically hold them dramatically important in their life, even 10, 20 years later.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I wanted to ask your opinion on use of meditation, yoga, and potentially psychedelics as well, and it induces this experience. What are your thoughts on meditation as a practice, psychedelics, and these kind of psychotechnic practices? Do you see those as something that can be beneficial for just everybody to start to learn how to engage in, and how you view those practices
Sure.
and those things?
Well, to start with your point about the transformative element of aspect of these experiences, in our survey and in the data that we've published and presented about that survey, as you said, I mean, basically 80-90% of people will report that these experiences transform their lives, and not just in one small aspect, but change their psychological well-being, their physical well-being, their sense of meaning and purpose in life, their sense of spirituality and religiousness, their fear of death. So it really has it has a massive impact on people when they have these mystical experiences. So
Yeah.
there's no question that they are transformative, and in and of itself, that is quite a fascinating issue from a kind of neurotheological perspective. How does that even happen? How do we rearrange
Yeah.
our brain in a very short period of time? And the short answer is we don't know yet. But there's probably a limited number of possibilities. I mean, one is that that these new other ways of thinking were sort of always in our brain, and now we just have access to them, kind of like accessing a new character in a video game or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, or that the brain literally, kind of rewires itself in what seem to be minutes, or seconds, and we don't quite know exactly how that might happen, but it seems to be the case that it can happen. So that is quite fascinating, and of course, then I think, that leads us to the question that you're asking, which is the mechanism by which people get into those experiences and get to them. And there are many technologies, if I can use that word,
Yeah.
by which people can get into those experiences. And they go back, all of them kind of go back thousands of years. I mean, meditation and prayer have been around for thousands of years. And even a lot of the psychedelic compounds and mushrooms and so forth have been used by shamanic cultures around the world for thousands of years to induce spiritual states.
Yeah.
And interestingly, again, in our survey as well as in other research, the psychedelically associated experiences seem to be every bit as real and spiritual feeling, or can be at least, as the more quote unquote natural experiences. So I think, all of these practices have the potential to be useful, have the potential to be able to affect the brain in ways that helps to facilitate these experiences. But interestingly, I mean, the experiences are also somewhat different in and of themselves, meaning that, I mean, you can meditate for 30 years and never have a mystical experience, or, you can meditate for a week and have one. And meditation itself isn't a mystical experience, but it can help to facilitate such an experience. So it kind of, primes the brain, if you will. And we have some other research studies that have looked at that, and even looked at specific neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin that show how meditation practices actually affect the brain's sensitivity to these neurotransmitters, so that someday when you actually have that experience, your brain is very receptive to that. Now, the psychedelics kind of come at it from a different direction, where they go in and directly affect these serotonin, primarily the serotonin system, although some of the other neurotransmitter systems as well, and wind up resulting in these kinds of experiences. So from a neurotheological perspective, the psychedelic studies are very relevant and interesting, because we know where they go. We know that they affect such and such serotonin, the serotonin 2A system, or the dopamine
Yeah.
system, or whatever. And so by looking at that, and then looking at the concomitant experiences associated with them, that can help us to understand what brain areas are involved, and they're from a research perspective, there's more I'm not sure if consistency is the right word, but more predictability, I guess, is maybe the best word. So that if I
Yeah.
give you something now, I know that sometime in the next half hour, you're going to have a very unusual experience, which is different than meditation, where again,
Yeah.
you may need to meditate for 30 years before you have that same experience. So it certainly helps from a scientific perspective. And of course, there's been a huge move in the direction of studying psychedelics from the perspective of psychological issues, and seeing if the transformative piece of taking these compounds can be beneficial for people dealing with depression, dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, and things like that, as a way of transforming them. And the data are, certainly very, very interesting and very compelling. And we need to learn a little bit more about it, but it could be a very important avenue towards helping people. So in that regard, pursuing one of these approaches that helps people to get to these experiences, if that's the goal of the person, they really can be quite wonderful, and they can be quite transformative. And the data, again, that we have also shows that they are almost uniformly transformative in a positive direction.
Yeah.
So while 90% of people have an effect, 90% are having a positive effect. Now there's a small percentage that do have a negative effect, and this is also a very interesting
Yeah.
neurotheological question. which is what happens when these practices or when religion and spirituality go awry, and what happens when people either have a negative experience or it leads to, more depression or even, violent behaviors and things like that. So again, there's a lot of stuff for us to be able to look at to try to better understand these different approaches. And the last thing I'll say about this specific question is that
Yeah.
even when it comes to the psychedelics, I think an important point that needs to be considered is the environment in which it occurs, and what the person's goals are. If somebody goes to a rave and takes some psilocybin and has some crazy experience, it may not necessarily go that well, and it certainly may not be all that transformative, and that
Yeah.
sometimes can lead towards, drug addictions and a lot of bad stuff. But if it's guided properly, and there's counselors who can help a person understand the experience, or if the person really is striving for something
Yeah.
spiritual, then it is certainly far more likely to result in a kind of experience that can be beneficial and transformative.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's interesting. And we have those outliers, like you mentioned, the negative experiences that occur. And
Right.
it seems like, with anything, you're always going to have, when we're looking at 80 to 90% transformatively positive, and then you have some negative outliers. Those will kind of always be there no matter what, in anything. But it is
Yep.
significant. It is statistically significant psychologically within the literature that it is 80 to 90% of these people are reporting these experiences. So like you said, it's profound, and it's beyond its worthwhileness to pursue its research. I would have to assume, especially yourself, somebody in academia in this field with the ability to do that is very neat. And it's very awesome that the internet exists. Like on YouTube, watch a TED talk, like your TED talk, where you talked on the neuroscience of enlightenment. That was the title of it. And you mentioned in there the happy prison of the brain. I love that term, because it is true. That is what it is. You're kind of, and your brain is, one thing I was going to mention is it's interesting to me how the brain resides, it's inside your skull. And so everything you see has to be assembled by it, but it never is exposed to the world, which is kind of a wacky
Right.
thing to think about.
Yeah. I mean, everything comes in through our senses, and we take what we hear, see, feel, and interpret those stimuli. I mean, again, even breaking it down, I mean, we don't see colors technically. I mean, we see wavelengths, and different wavelengths turn on the rods and cones in our eyes and evoke signals back in our occipital lobe, and we see a red car or something like that. And
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's the subjectivity aspect of it that brought me to
right.
consciousness studies. Was, why is it when I see a red car, I may think of this red car I had when I was 17 that I got
Exactly.
up, or you could think of it as a car your deceased relative owned and make you sad. Those
Right.
kinds of phenomena became increasingly odd to me.
Sure.
Think on, because I was like, where does this come from? And then looking at
Smells, the
exactly,
smell of
yeah,
your old room, or
yeah,
the smell of school when you were in kindergarten or something like that, the crayon smell.
exactly. And you were talking earlier about the quantum model being applied to consciousness by some people.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that, particularly just because I find a lot of intrigue in Sir Roger Penrose's research with Stuart Hameroff. Stuart Hameroff being an anesthesiologist, and Roger Penrose being a Nobel laureate in physics. They came together to formulate this idea of the orth-OR consciousness. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it basically is looking at the administration of anesthesia and where that mechanistically is occurring at the level of the neuron. Because if what I found and wanted to ask you about is, anesthesia is an interesting area of study when it comes to consciousness, because a patient can be biologically viable but unresponsive. So it's not really sleep, but it's a different state. And so I was going to ask you how you look at levels of consciousness as it applies to that in the brain, and how much credence you may give to this idea that at the neuron level, the interruption by anesthesia, could that potentially, in your mind, lead us positively towards an answer to the hard problem of subjectivity and memory and things like that?
It could. Part of we wrote another book called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, where we actually talk about kind of a scalar model of consciousness. And I mean, what you're talking about too, and this is always kind of a challenge. I mean, in medicine, when we say somebody is conscious, we don't mean that they have self-awareness per se. We just mean whether they're awake and
Yeah.
responding to us, which is different. And when we talk about levels of consciousness, especially as you think about like animal consciousness and so forth, I mean, arguably speaking, an amoeba has some awareness of the world because it moves towards a food source, or a plant moves towards the sun or something like that. So there's an awareness that's going on, but the question is there sort of an awareness of an awareness? And then you don't
Yeah.
really see that until you get, typically more towards higher primates, maybe dolphins, and certainly human beings, where we have that sense of our own awareness of the world around us. And then, as you said, I mean, there are some interesting issues about what happens when we're affected by different medications like anesthetics, disorders where somebody, has a stroke and then they lose consciousness, but they look awake, or, I mean,
Yeah.
what they're able to perceive or not perceive while they're unresponsive to us. And but yeah, I mean, I think all of this kind of work is valuable and helpful. I mean, it is such a hard problem that
Yeah.
I don't know if we will ever discover the answer to it. Although it's I'm a never say never kind of guy, so we might find the right way to develop our abilities to explore that. But it really is quite a challenge. We have to think about how we even as an investigator, we are trapped within our own consciousness, kind of looking out and trying to measure consciousness, trying to measure the brain, and how so we're sort of caught up in the same kind of problem. In fact, in my book, Principles of Neurotheology, I talk about the neurotheological uncertainty principle, sort of like Heisenberg's
Oh
uncertainty
yeah.
principle, which gets to this kind of very point, which is that as we measure this, we're sort of part of the measurement, and we're part of the thing that we're trying to measure. And so we may never be able to sort of isolate the brain and isolate consciousness, just like in Heisenberg, you can't isolate momentum and location at the same time. You can't isolate the consciousness and the biology at the same time, because as soon as you try to isolate one, the other one is inherently changed by that
Seems to be.
measurement. So it's but we need to keep trying, and it's great to keep asking those questions. And so again, this is also where I think neurotheology is important, because it says that what neurotheology talks about is understanding the subjective nature of these experiences, the subjective nature of consciousness, as well as the biological piece as well, and really taking both sides very seriously, and trying to kind of capture both sides. And I don't know, I don't, it may be that we ultimately need to do the, self-experimentation. I may need to scan my own brain while I am conscious of my,
Oh.
own looking at my own brain, and I don't know, I've never been able to figure it out exactly.
I understand
But
that.
I
Yeah,
keep
it's a
trying.
hard problem. Yeah, and it's important too that there be work done in the anesthesia side too. I think, in my opinion, it seems like there could be compassion to brain dead or unconscious patients more shown a little bit better. Not because it's shown poorly now, but just because the measurement scale of consciousness doesn't seem to be there super well isolated. Like you don't know for a fact what is 1 to 10, how conscious is a person? Well, are they awake or are they not? I mean, it's
Right.
you could be, sometimes they have like a anesthesia awareness occur where somebody's aware, during a surgery where they're like aware, but they can't say anything because of the paralytic. So
Right.
it's kind of
Right.
we don't want patients. I mean, I assume, I'm not a medical practitioner, but I would assume that it would be the goal to limit those occurrences, because
Oh yeah, I mean those paralytic, that when I was in residency, I mean that was one of the things that they always talked about. I mean, you don't want to paralyze somebody and just let their brain otherwise be fully aware of what's going on. I mean, that's an extraordinarily scary and upsetting state. So, trying to figure all those things out has implications on a very practical level in terms of how we
yeah,
take care of patients, as well as on a philosophical level, and what these things actually mean. But and there is some interesting spillover into all aspects of medicine in terms of the subjective nature of how we feel. Whether it's pain, whether it's anxiety, depression. I have no way of knowing what you're feeling right now. I mean, you could be horribly depressed right now. You could be extraordinarily anxious or completely fine. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of guess based on your, your facial expressions and things like that, but I have no true way of knowing what you're feeling on the inside. And the same thing, we take care of a lot of patients here with chronic pain syndromes and in the integrative medicine center. And there's no way to tell how much pain somebody's in and what it means to them and how it affects them unless you ask them. And the same thing is true with consciousness and spirituality. So there are really some fascinating problems that spill over into all these different levels of thinking about things.
No, absolutely. The interesting thing kind of you mentioned there is, yeah, we can't, our skin and our organism is separated from the environment, of course. And when we feel pain, we only feel our pain physically. We don't
Right.
feel another's. However, I guess maybe there's some merit to the idea of somebody being able to sense more intuitively what somebody else is feeling. Like maybe a psychiatrist would be overtly attuned to being able to walk into a situation without knowledge of what's necessarily going on, but by sharing brief dialogue with an individual, they can already be like, well, the real situation here is this person's feeling this way, and do it better and feel. I don't know if there's any merit to, like, if you could actually take on those feelings and feel sadness that another is feeling. I'm sure there's people who think that that's a possibility where you could actually empathetically, tangibly feel like empathy that's actually transmitting between people. But I don't know if that's too much science involved in that. But you're right that the whole idea of us being able to just internalize our own feelings gives us a unique kind of angle by which to look at the world, because we have to answer the question of subjectivity and why it's there. And it seems
Right.
like religion seems to be where I had to end up to get these answers, because they're so, basically when I read the Bible and I look at Genesis and I see they ate of this apple of knowledge of good and evil, and then they were aware they were naked. Well, to me, that's kind of like the Bible explaining the origin of self-consciousness. It was somebody trying
Right.
to look, they didn't know they were naked before because they had no idea that they are a self. So then the
Right.
pulling of the human, and what's interesting is when I had ketamine treatment administered to me a long time ago for some anxiety symptoms that were really, really harsh, and I wanted to get off of benzodiazepines completely. I didn't want any more of those, so I did. I mean, I have, and I've done it successfully. It was just rough. The ketamine treatment really set off into motion a lot of these questions.
Yeah.
And meditation is what I picked up after ketamine use. After the administration of ketamine, I picked up meditation because it brought me back to those experiences that I had on the ketamine, almost to where I felt like my physical body was dead and I was looking outwardly into it on ketamine. And the reason I was saying that is just because the questions that came up were started with the nature of subjectivity and how subatomic particles could rearrange and become conscious in some way. That didn't make any sense to me, how you could have a rock and then you could rearrange the atoms and then you would have something that would become conscious ever. It doesn't seem intuitive to me that could even happen. And then it led me to looking into good and evil and philosophy a lot for some reason. That was
Right.
a step. And then I was reading the Bible. I was like, oh, it's a knowledge of good and evil that they ate from. Then they were self-consciously aware of self. So it seems like maybe if we can't ever really answer this question without subjective reporting, I mean, that's the main way, then we could look into it, but it ultimately may come down to relying on these ancient texts that seem to write something like that long ago, that says somebody was aware of themselves all of a sudden after doing something wrong. That means these problems were there, they were answering them a long time ago.
Right.
So maybe in I don't know, but potentially it would lie there, putting your belief in something supervenient, superordinate, and then relying on those manuscripts and texts to kind of answer these tough questions. Because, like you said, observing it has an impasse at some point where you can only observe so much.
Well, and clearly people were having these kinds of experiences back then because that is what they were talking about. And so whether it's through Hindu or Buddhist scriptures, or whether it's the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, there's certainly a lot of understanding about how we are as human beings. And I think, again, I think that's a very important part of neurotheology, and trying to understand what that side of things brings to the table. But then again, there's also this whole other biological side which we need to think about as well. So we have a lot of questions left. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also, since your work in neuroscience, I recently read a book and talked to Dr. Jonas Kaplan from UCLA. He does a lot of work on mindfulness and stuff like that. Very intriguing fella, and I enjoyed talking with him. Well, he mentioned a gentleman named Anthony Damasio, who was his colleague, and he wrote a book called Feeling and Knowing that I recently read, and it relies heavily on the idea of the central nervous system having to be in play within an organism prior to consciousness being there, because the central nervous system is what's relaying the feelings to the brain, basically telling the self that it's in pain. If there's no nervous system, then you have really no you have no implicit re-representation of what's occurring. There's not these maps of the body to relay it to. So yeah, so basically his argument rests on the idea of a lower level intelligence that drives our biological homeostatic operations, and then a higher level of cognition that occurs when we can utilize reason to alter our future. Basically, we know we're a self today. We know we'll probably exist tomorrow. So how we act today, we're going to reason through these actions we do today to make sure that tomorrow doesn't suck. And that could apply to a year from now. Animals don't generally do that. Plants obviously can't move. Aristotelian, it would kind of like Aristotle would kind of say, like, you have plants, animals, humans, and you have immobility in plants, then you have mobility in animals, and then you have reason in humans. And that's kind of the collective breakdown of it. And so I was just kind of wanting to ask you what your thoughts are on the uniqueness of the nervous system and its role that it plays in its evolution of the nervous system, and how that may be something unique, and how you see that in the role of consciousness.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly, as you were just alluding to, I mean, there's clearly a relationship. It's certainly very relevant. If we are trapped inside of our brain, I mean, the only windows into that are through our eyes and ears and the senses. And so we do interact with the world out there, and we do learn about the world as well as ourselves through those interactions with the central nervous system. And so, the nervous system certainly is a fundamental part of our consciousness in some way, but whether it is a wonderful radio receiver of consciousness, or whether it is generating consciousness, or some other relationship, that, again, those are the big questions that we really have to figure out. And I think, if we're clever and we think about our research in certain ways, I mean, there are. You were sort of touching on this a little bit in the discussion about anesthesia and some of these and issues surrounding death. Near-death experiences are a very interesting area for us to look at in this regard, because theoretically the brain, or certainly the body, has died, and the brain seems to have some residual activity. In fact, an interesting study that just got released was a case report on somebody who went through the dying process, and they were recording EEGs of the brain, and could see that there was ongoing activity even after stopping of the heart. Now, unfortunately, again, the person is not responsive, so we don't know what they were thinking, so to speak, or what they were feeling on the inside, because we have no way of doing that. But there's something going on, and of course, in near-death experiences in particular, one of the common anecdotal reports that we get is that people literally leave their body and they float up to the ceiling, or they go down the hall and they see somebody in another room. And people are actively have designed some very clever studies to see if we can really test that and prove that, because if we can demonstrate that actually happens, we really have a paradigm shift on our hands in terms of how our brain is related to consciousness. And so it's a bit of a stay tuned, but it's quite interesting. And so again, there are, whether it's through the study of near-death experiences or drug-induced states or mystical experiences, all of them put together are these pieces of a wonderful puzzle to try to figure it all out. And hopefully we'll continue to try. And that to me is where neurotheology comes in, I hope, because it kind of straddles that issue. It straddles consciousness in the brain, spirituality and material reality, and the mystical world and the everyday world, and says we kind of have to hang on to both sides, at least until we get an answer. I mean, we may find that consciousness is beyond the brain, or we may find that consciousness is only generated by the brain. But until we can say that for sure, one way or another, we kind of need to keep using both sides, because we don't know,
Yeah.
what that ultimate relationship may be.
Well said. Yeah, and that's what's so brilliant about neurotheology is I just recently, as I've the reason that I even started this podcast really was because I had just could not shake this question that had come to me after meditative experiences, started with ketamine experience and then meditation continually, and couldn't shake some of these questions. And so I would go from one person to the next as far as historian, philosopher, and I would capture some things like, wow, this is why people hold Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates so high. I finally get what they were saying, why they were so
Right.
with what virtue is. Before I was, who cares what it is? Now it's like, oh, these people were talking about the biggest questions that ever could be asked, and they make
Right.
sense but there's a stark difference between before, when I didn't even care or get or understand what these books were about, to a dramatic reshift of, because I had tried to read the Symposium, the Republic before, and 10 pages in, I'm done with that. Now it's like, I get what they're saying. So the neurotheology aspect of it was something I know had to at least reconstruct itself or arrange itself differently within my view,
Right.
or whether that's mind, matter, brain, body, I don't know, but it's certainly interest level in it increased dramatically, and my priorities arranged around that endeavor, essentially, outside of my daily priorities, I mean, of course, but
Sure.
um,
Well, and that also has a lot to do, with everything that we're talking about, which is how do we decide what information to use, and that, which things are important to us. And so many of us go through life, maybe not worrying about the philosophical, or not worrying about one thing or another, but it depends on what things have meaning and import, and how we decide to kind of craft our ideas about the world. And if interestingly, when you look at like neurotheology as a concept, I mean, there are some very, very staunch materialists who are like, well, I don't need to worry about the spiritual world, and there's very staunch religious individuals who say, that's really the right thing, and I don't really, the biological is here, but that's not really relevant. It's really God's realm over here. I feel like we need to kind of use both sides, but
yeah,
but nonetheless, I mean, again, from the meta perspective, the interesting question is how does each one of us make a determination of the information that we decide to use and keep, and again, I mean, there's some very
that's a good
pragmatic
point.
pieces to this too. I mean, everything that we've just been through with this whole COVID thing, and hopefully we're finally wrapping it up. But when people
Yeah,
are looking at a vaccine, or masks or whatever, how are people coming to the determination as to, is it good, is it bad, is it right, is it wrong, is it for me, is it for everyone? There's things that are going on in our brain, and our consciousness that lead us down those paths, and it's our own experiences, or it's our own risk, aversion versus risk taking.
yeah,
It's there's I mean, that to me is where the real fascination comes, ultimately, and that hopefully that gets us to help one side or the other, or obviously there could be multiple sides, know enough about the other sides, to realize that, well, their brains were just doing the same thing that mine was. But I decided to accept this study and not that study. I decided to accept this theory and
yeah.
not that theory. And why does one theory or concept or whatever make sense to us versus another? And again, these are great questions, and the challenge is trying to find the answers.
No, yeah, without a doubt, that's the challenge. But it's a challenge worth taking, knowing that you may never even succeed in it. It's still it's one of the few challenges that somebody would say. You would say you're going to lose, you're not going to win, you'll probably end up back where you started, and still be like, oh yeah, I'll sign up for that, okay, because it's a worthwhile pursuit.
Right. Well, I do think, to me, I do think that, again, not to be trite about this, but a
yeah,
lot of times it's the journey itself, not necessarily
yeah.
the destination that becomes relevant, and
Yeah,
we're
you
all
really
on the
start
same
to see
journey.
things like that. You
Yeah.
start to see that aspect of these cliches become embodied, because one of the
Yeah.
interesting things about cliches is, as a child and as a maturing young adult, you, at least me and a lot of people, I assume, just got annoyed with them because they're overstated, they're said too many times, they don't have any value or meaning. Then I started to realize that all of them actually have the most meaning. They actually all make sense. These cliches do. A journey is better than the destination. That kind of thing starts to reveal itself as the most true.
Right.
That's why they become cliches, I suppose.
Exactly.
What you were saying too is, how do we select between the information? How do we discern accurately between what's true and what's fiction? And that's kind of a Platonic idea too, because Plato would talk about relevance, realization, and what's salient, basically having a good way of determining what's BS and what isn't. And being able to do that quickly is important, because you can waste time, not waste time, but you can chase an idea that's doomed, because you don't have some objectivity in how you see the world. You have too much subjectivity and ability to change and your beliefs too quickly. So anything can lurch out at you and change your cognition. But Plato would kind of talk about that and say, when consciousness shifts, when somebody goes through it, like at the Eleusinian mysteries, there's debate there if those were being had with psychedelics or not. There's people pursuing that endeavor. But either way, Plato would say during those experiences, whatever they were saying they were, they would change the way they saw the world, and things that were salient prior are no longer salient in their environment anymore. So basically your consciousness is, when you look at, right now I'm sitting in here and I could look at all these books on my table or whatever. I have a lot of stuff I could absorb and take in. Whatever I choose to put my attention on and make that salient, then it becomes consciously aware of it, and I can attribute it to memory. And so there's something in that process where, when consciousness, or when somebody has those mystical experiences, it seems to me their barometer for what's true and what isn't, intuitively, their salient landscape changes. It's what you put your attention on becomes different. And innately, you just start focusing on different aspects of reality than you used to. And so you're noticing patterns more, you're noticing archetypes that emerge in reality a little more. That's at least what I noticed for myself, is going through meditation. And that speaks to neurotheology too. There's got to be this inevitable change that's occurring in the brain. Like you said, is it mind, matter? But ultimately the pursuit of neurotheology. And as I proceed into looking into all of your work, I hope to get a clearer image of your mind of how you see this whole ordeal. And that's why I appreciate you very much for coming on and talking with me today.
It's my pleasure, Deb. And it does this whole issue about what kind, what pieces of data we're okay with, and how we decide to come to the conclusions that we do. It is a fascinating issue, and it's something that has so many different angles and facets to it. And as you said, I mean, the other thing that we didn't quite state is that while we're talking about being trapped in our brain, the information that is available to us relative to the size of the universe is like 0.0000 and 25 zeros, 1%. So how do we even it's remarkable that we wake up in the morning and think and say, gee, I think I know what's going on.
No shit.
And yet we do, but I mean, that's why, it's really quite remarkable how our brain and our consciousness is able to operate with such little knowledge and information about the world. And I think that that's part of where sometimes these mystical experiences come in, because you kind of see the world in a different kind of way, and in a larger, grander way. Which again, we can debate whether that's the accurate way or not, but certainly, leads to these different perspectives that people have. And I mean, it is interesting too that there are convergences that occur that, in the mystical experience, we see sort of an interconnectedness of all things, a oneness of all things. And in many ways, science, starts to say the same kind of thing. I mean, when you get down to quantum mechanics, and that everything that's matter is based on like the Higgs field, and that all matter is energy. I mean, there are certain things that all the trees are interconnected and the environment's interconnected. So there is that sense in both the materialistic as well as the religious or spiritual or philosophical perspectives, that of a commonality ultimately in terms, or concordance of thinking about things. But it's how those connections are actually made, and is there something that is, is it all just a material connection, or is there something that goes beyond that? Again, I'm in an integrative medicine center, we say, but really there's just medicine. I mean, it's just, we're trying to bring everything together into one. So,
Yeah.
I don't know. I sort of feel funny when people say, well, there's a supernatural, to me, if there's a supernatural realm, well, that's the natural realm also then. I mean, like there's
Yes.
like
Yeah.
everything has to be all part of the same thing.
Yeah, it's one and the same. If an atom
Right.
is if you can cut something up into infinitely until it gets to an atom, then that means this computer has atoms in it. It just appeared, So
Right.
it's still fundamentally made of just a mass of atoms, but it's ultimately represented as a computer. I see what you're saying. Yeah, this shift of thought of the salient landscape changing is kind of like what happened in the Renaissance or something like that, where you start seeing artwork being done of depicting God from inside instead of God on the outside. Prior to the Renaissance, it seems like most of the artwork that I notice and see, it depicts God as coming from the outside to intervene. Like if somebody's stabbing somebody in a picture, God grabs their arm, pulls it back.
Right.
Kind of talking about this from another gentleman that pointed this out, that I found when he pointed this out, it kind of really struck me as fascinating because of this fundamental shift that, now we have like statues and sculptures of the thinker and the inside of the mind controlling the outside, and how what we do affects the world instead of this external. So it's a shift kind of fundamentally in what's salient, how thought and what you make relevant in your field of senses kind of seems to be at the cusp of it anyways, I think. And so that's why I look forward to further. There's a lot of content you have on YouTube, and so I'm just gonna post a link to your channel to encourage other people to go and get more detailed information on this. But
Thank you.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thoroughly enjoyed
I
it.
appreciate it. And they can always go to my website too, which is andrewnewberg.com, and
Awesome.
find out about the research that we've talked about in more detail, as well as the new work that we're trying to put together. We're just scratching the surface, and there's a lot to go. So
I'm
it's
excited.
exciting, but
I'm
daunting
excited
at the
to
same
see
time.
Well, I hope we get in the future, as I get further into your work and further down this road of making my podcast and everything, hopefully we talk again. And
Yes, please do.
it was very I very much enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on, but I'll let you go now since it's been an hour, but I very much enjoyed it. Thank you, Dr. Newman.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.